The Catholic military orders are among the most famous fighting forces of the medieval period, serving as the tip of Christendom's lance for several centuries and earning them a reputation which lasts even today. However, like many idealized groups and individuals from eras before our own, these martial orders have accrued a great deal of myth, legend, and fabrication which must be dispelled so that the truth can be revealed. In this mini-series on the religious orders of Latin Christendom, we will cover the three most famous: the Teutonic Knights, Templars, and the subject of our first video, the Hospitallers, a perfect example of how war changes everything affected by it. Shout out to Imperator Rome and Paradox Interactive for sponsoring this video. Paradox is dedicated to making the game better, and as was the case with the previous three updates, Update 1.4, called Archimedes, is free and contains an entire overhaul. This time the religious system is revamped. Appoint state deities, gaining constant passive bonuses, and invoke their power. Revered relics can be stored in your national treasury, earning small bonuses. If you sack an enemy's holy sites or capital, there is a chance you might capture these special artifacts. Archimedes also adds many quality of life improvements, and more free updates are on the way, with an overhaul of the culture system in summer and the military system in autumn. Imperator Rome is on a free trial from March 31st to April 5th, and you can buy it with a 50% discount during this period. Support our channel and get this great game by clicking the link in the description. The order of the famous Hospitaller Knights did not begin with caparison-clad horses, fully armoured warriors, and lances couched towards a heathen enemy. Instead, in many ways one of the most famous holy orders began in a far more humble and peaceful manner. Rather than warriors, the Hospitallers had their origins as an order of caretakers who nevertheless harkened back to pre-Roman history for mythical origins. It is said that long before Christ died on the cross, a legendary Greek king known as Antiochus, whose realm occupied Jerusalem, wished to viciously punish a Jewish high priest known as Melchior for desecrating the tomb of David. However, divine intervention supposedly persuaded the king to have mercy on the condemned man, and instead build a hospital in Jerusalem. This hospital would later shelter the Virgin Mary, the Apostles, and even Christ himself. The mythology of King Antiochus's foundation of this earliest hospitaller institution is almost certainly false, but what became the Church of St. John the Baptist in Jerusalem may have had charitable hospices assisting Latin pilgrims as early as 603, when Pope Gregory I founded one there. Centuries passed with little detail, during which the Proto-Hospitallers provided for Christian pilgrims in Muslim-controlled Jerusalem. As aid, the hospices received contributions from wealthy European benefactors, such as the Amalfitan merchant Mauro of Pantileone. With their assistance and funds, many further hospitals were probably established and disbanded on nearby sites in Jerusalem, but we know little of the detail. However, the Hospital of St. John proper was founded between 1063 and 1070 in Fatimid-controlled Jerusalem, serving as a combination of an infirmary for the sick and a way station or lodging house for weary travelling pilgrims. The medieval period was an age in which these two functions often fused. 70 years later, a chronicler known as William of Tyre referred to the hospital as a Xenodochium, in which were gathered many people, well and sick. Everything changed for the hospital in the year 1099, when Latin Crusaders first laid siege to Jerusalem during the First Crusade. Most of the city's small Christian population had already been expelled from the city, but the hospital's head, Gerard, stayed behind to tend the sick. At this point, we receive another foundation legend rooted within the siege itself. Gerard, who understandably had sympathies with his fellow Christians suffering in siege outside the walls, supposedly took loaves of bread to the walls and threw them at the starving army outside. To do this, he pretended that the loaves were rocks to attack the enemy force, but he was in fact feeding them. Muslim guards realized what was happening and brought Gerard to their commander, but when they did, all of the bread carried by Gerard had miraculously turned to stone. The rector was freed, and when Jerusalem was conquered, he received gifts from the Crusader leaders for his assistance. Over a decade later, the Hospital of St. John gained its independence from the larger churches surrounding it when Pope Paschal II issued the Pie Postulatio Voluntatis on February 15, 1113. This took the hospital and everything it acquired under the Pope's personal authority, and directed these resources towards the sustenance of pilgrims and the poor. Payment of tithes to the church were halted. The order was granted the right to elect its future masters from its own ranks, and the Proto-Hospitaller order was elevated higher than any similar institution in Europe at the time. Following the First Crusade, and especially after the order became an independent entity, it also began to militarize and take the form which we know it as commonly. From a simple hospital taking care of the sick, the order began to morph truly into the Knights Hospitaller. When the crusade concluded with the seizure of Jerusalem in 1099, many of the victorious crusaders went home. However, relatively large contingents of knights did stay in the Holy Land to continue their holy duties, and it is here that we can find the origins of the order's knights. A 17th century manuscript remnant tells us that when the Hospitaller's wealth had grown to massive levels, it hired some of these leftover Crusader knights, tasking them with protecting the order's property, and with the pious goal of driving back the pagans. Gradually it is said that the martial elements which were brought into the order came to dominate it, and the normal priests were sidelined in positions of authority. Another account by one William Cowson, Vice-Chancellor of Rhodes, tells us a more heroic tale of his order's origins. He recounts instead that devout persons on pilgrimage took up arms for defense of the Catholic faith, induced by divine zeal. As might be expected, different versions inform us of different motivations and intentions, but what is certain is that a number of post-crusade warriors took up the cross for the hospital as brothers-at-arms. By 1136, the order's military strength, administrative prowess, and wealth had advanced to the extent that they were able to take up the defense and maintenance of Beth Gibelin Castle, which was granted to them by the King of Jerusalem. 6 years later, they were entrusted with even greater responsibilities over the frontier between Islamic-held lands and the county of Tripoli. Count Raymond II bestowed upon the Hospitallers castles at Crec de Chevalier, Anaz, Tel Kala, Kalat el Feliz, and Mardebek. They were to be held by the order as quasi-independent fiefs in return for defending the border against Muslim forces, particularly Zangi of Mosul. Now, with the foggy beginning of the order's history established, we will go over its responsibilities of care and protection, looking at how the Hospitallers accomplished each one in turn. Christian teachings had always focused on a concern for the poor and needy. However, as Western Europe developed economically throughout the 11th century, the prominence of towns and the poverty they often generated was becoming more visible. Jerusalem was one of these towns, having received many ill, impoverished, or elderly pilgrims. The Hospitallers brought this reverence of poverty to a new level, portraying themselves as the serfs and slaves of his lords, who were the sick people of the world. In that way, it seems that the brothers of the order imagined themselves as the property of their patients. To this end, an orderman's clothes were generally humble and minimal. He was expected to wash patients and remake their beds. This even extended to noble brothers of the sword, who would routinely surrender their war horses to provide transportation to injured men after battles. During their time in the Levant, the Hospitallers operated various institutions which were focused on treating diseases which were actually curable, compared to conditions like leprosy, which at the time were not. The Order's main hospital in their first headquarters of Jerusalem occupied a large space to the south of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It possessed 11 wards and could, in a standard situation, take in as many as 1,000 patients. In a crisis situation, it could even be enlarged to deal with double that total, such as in the aftermath of the Battle of Mongiscar in 1177, when it admitted an extra 750 wounded in a short period, in addition to 900 regular patients. While a single main hospital in Jerusalem, and later in Acre, was the center of the Order's operations, it was by no means the only one. The Hospitallers also ran the German Hospital of St. Mary in Jerusalem, the Infirmary of Aquabella, various graveyards to bury the dead, and even a mobile medical train which accompanied and supported Christian armies on campaign. The bulk of the work of healing the sick was performed by relatively highly educated physici, essentially physicians, who were employed and had something like medieval university degrees. Meanwhile, nursing was performed by servants of both sexes, who had to make the beds, feed the patients, talk to them, and perform other daily tasks. Very much contrary to most medical services of the Middle Ages, the Order also operated a makeshift ambulance service throughout the Holy City. A 12th century directive to Hospitaller brothers states that, if the nature of the illness of the poor deprives them of strength, so that they cannot make the effort to reach the Hospital of St. John, mercifully seek them through the city and have them conveyed there by servants. Beyond their duties to the sick and poor, Hospitallers assisted the population with a facility which might be best compared to modern-day food banks. The poor of Jerusalem, and especially new mothers and their babies, could go to the Order's almonry and receive money and food to sustain themselves as best they could. Also in service of young people was the large orphanage which the Hospitallers founded in Jerusalem. Babies were allotted well-paid wet nurses who were regularly subject to inspection by sisters of the Order. When the children grew up, they, including girls, were educated, and therefore could make a life for themselves in the world or continue to serve the Order. Their motivation for particularly focusing on children was as follows: recalling in loving memory that whereas animals are born with protection against inclement weather, beasts with hair, birds with feathers, fish with scales, tortoises with shells, man alone is born naked and defenseless. With their civilian and charitable services outlined, we will now detail the more famous branch of the Hospitaller Order, those forces focused on defending Christians and engaging in military action alongside the Templars and other similar organizations. In the later 13th century, Master of the Order Hugh Revell believed that there were around 300 full Hospitaller brothers in the East. It is likely that this was the maximum number of knights in residence at any given time in the Order's Levantine history, primarily due to shortage of funds. These brothers in the East were recruited from amongst fit and relatively young men from Western Europe, while older members of the Hospitaller Order remained in Europe itself, administering the always expanding support and recruitment network. France and England were the primary manpower reserves from which the Hospitallers drew, followed by Bohemia and Hungary. While the Holy Roman Empire also had great potential, there was reluctance for Germans to join an order which was so close to the papacy when it and the empire were quarrelling. Contrary to the popular perception, sword brothers of the Hospitaller Order were not solely recruited from the noble classes during the 12th and 13th centuries. That preference for those of knightly rank who brought a considerable donation only began during the 1260s. Before that point, all recruits simply had to be free, born legitimately, spiritually clean, fit to fight, and not in financial debt. A number of other small groups lingered on the edge of being a full Hospitaller brother. These included, but were not limited to, the Donats, noblemen who wished to join the Order fully and had travelled to the Holy Land, but had to wait in a queue before they could take their oaths. Due to their almost permanent lack of full brothers, when disaster struck in battle, it could cripple the Order's military strength. However, appeals to Europe often made good the losses. After the disasters of 1187 against Saladin, a body of newly recruited Hospitallers from the west quickly came to the Holy Land and filled the void. When the scarcity of full Hospitaller brothers is revealed, it can raise eyebrows and questions as to just how the Order managed to maintain itself as a military power. The answer is that these oathed warriors only formed the core of any Hospitaller army, whose numbers commonly had to be padded out with other warriors. Most of the Holy Land's major interfaith confrontations required a unified Christian response, which would commonly include the Crusader state armies along with both the Templars and Hospitallers. However, the Hospitallers themselves could muster more than just their few hundred brothers. In fact, a vast majority of the Order's soldiers were actually mercenaries, many of them either indigenous light horsemen known as Turcopoles, or similarly armed Latin units who fought for pay. Mercenary units of engineers and siegecraft specialists were also employed to breach enemy fortifications. On many occasions, the Order possessed siege weaponry which skilled artisans would have been required to maintain and use. We will talk about other military orders in our future videos, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.